The Southern Alberta Council on Public Affairs acknowledges that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains, and we pay respect to the Blackfoot people, past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. We offer respect to the Métis and all who have lived on this land and made Lethbridge their home.
Welcome to SACPA's 57th year as a not-for-profit society. I'd like to remind everybody to please take a moment to also silence your cell phones. We're going to try and clock in for this next hour and stay focused. I am a new face here. This is actually my second time at a SACPA session, so I will take a minute to introduce myself. I am Shelby Zubak. I'm the Executive Director of the Lethbridge Public Interest Research Group. It's a very hefty name, but we're a nonprofit operating on campus at the University of Lethbridge, and we're also a student levy group. So we assist students getting involved in social and environmental justice initiatives and have worked for years with SACPA, so I'm very honored to be here as your moderator today. I've been told that you should know this speaker, so we won't take too long diving in. But we are welcoming Dr. Dwayne Bratt from the University of Calgary today. Dr. Bratt is a political science professor in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies at the Mount Royal University. And of course, what better topic to talk about now than what does the recent federal election results in Alberta and Saskatchewan tell us about Canadian unity? So we're going to go for about 25 to 30 minutes of the presentation. Questions are encouraged and expected, but we do ask that if you don't want to ask them in person, you funnel them towards myself at the front of this area here, or you wait until the end of the session when the Q&A period opens up, and we'll give you further instruction there. But without further ado, I would like to take a moment to welcome Dr. Dwayne Bratt.
So as I explained to Shelby over lunch, about 10 years ago I said yes to Knud to come down here. And when you say yes to him once, he never stops asking. So I always enjoy the trip down, except that one year when I got the speeding ticket outside of Claire's home. But I've learned from that experience. So this is a very hot topic. And so just to put this into context, it is Tuesday afternoon. I'm at a conference in Bellingham, Washington, and I took the afternoon away from the conference because I was doing CBC radio syndication across the country on this very topic, about basically Alberta separatism. I have written a piece that was commissioned by a news magazine in Italy. They translated it into Italian for me, which was helpful. And next week I am giving a TV interview with the Japanese public broadcaster. So this is an important issue. And in fact, even before the election results, I had given interviews with the Washington Post and Fox News about this because the Premier had made it an issue throughout the campaign. We've always had a separatist element in this province. Not just 1980, where we actually elected a separatist in Old Stidsbury from the Western Canada Concept. You go back to the 1950s and the Crow Rate and the railroad. I would even go back to 1905 and the creation of Alberta as a province created a separatist element the moment we joined Canada to leave Canada. What is different then about this is we've had this ebb and flow, and we would have been in a ebb around separatism, just as Quebec was, except this is being driven at the government level, and that is brand new. Jason Kenney would fight Ottawa, Peter Lougheed would fight Ottawa, Ralph Klein would fight Ottawa. Danielle Smith is different because she is either sympathetic to separatism, she sees it as a tool, or she actually is a separatist, and I will leave that for your own determination. Lougheed, Klein, Notley, Kenney, none of those people were. So that is new. And then another little twig is around, there's a group that actually doesn't want to become the Republic of Alberta. They would actually like to join the United States because they admire what Donald Trump stands for. Maybe, no, they do. They would not have wanted to join the U.S. if Kamala Harris was president, but they look at what Donald Trump is doing and go, yeah, we want more of that. So that's what is new. But all of this goes to the federal election. Had Pierre Poilievre become Prime Minister, we would not be having this debate. And I can put that forward in 3 ways. Way number 1 was early on in the campaign, Danielle Smith outlined a set of 9 demands that she wanted, if Carney was elected, to deal with within 6 months. Then early on in the campaign, Preston Manning, the former Reform Party leader, a mentor to Smith, wrote an op-ed in the Globe and Mail, and I'm sure that with the tacit approval of Danielle, that a vote for Carney was a vote for Alberta separatism. And then the very day after the election, she tabled legislation to change our election laws to make it easier for a separation referendum. So that's why I say this is all about the election results. So I do need to spend some time looking at the election. So I think this pretty much, picture tells 1,000 words. This is what the campaign looked like. Mark Carney was running against Donald Trump, and Pierre Poilievre was running against Justin Trudeau. And people do election prep or debate prep, and so there was clearly a rehearsed line that Mark Carney gave in the English language debate, but I think it resonated very well. And it was, he looked at Pierre Poilievre and he goes, you have spent 2 years campaigning against the carbon tax and Justin Trudeau, and you're mad because they're both gone. So that was clearly a message there. So as evidence, we really saw a tale of 2 campaigns, right? From a policy perspective, there actually wasn't much difference on how they would respond to the U.S. The difference is Mark Carney made it front and center, and Pierre Poilievre would make it about his 7th or 8th line. We need to look at the polls. So this is from October of 2021, at the time of the last election, up until January of 2025. And you can see the big shift that occurs in the fall of 2022 when Pierre Poilievre becomes leader of the Conservative Party. That's when the polls shift, and it gets wider and wider and wider and wider. And by early January of 2025, the Conservatives have a massive polling lead. Why did I stop in January 2025? Because 2 key events occur in January 2025. January 6th, Justin Trudeau announces he was resigning as Prime Minister of Canada. And the second was January 20th, when Donald Trump gets inaugurated as president. So if we look at the polls from January 6th to April of 2025 in the election, at the beginning of January, Poilievre still has that 25-point lead, and gradually it drops and drops and drops. The polls actually didn't change much during the election campaign. Where they changed was prior to the election campaign. This is the most remarkable political comeback of any party that I have seen since we started to do polls. And this is why Poilievre may be having some challenges within its own party, because even though their vote total went up, their seat total went up, they held the Liberals to not having a minority or not having a majority, but they blew a 25-point lead. There we go. These were the competing ballot box questions, and roughly a little more people voted with the Liberals on the Donald Trump issue, but there was a significant amount of Canadians, 8 million of them, who voted on the Conservatives, that it was time for a change. lost Liberal decade, axe the tax, build the home, stop the crime, fix the budget. You'll notice those are all three-word slogans. And that's because political psychologists have shown how effective three-word slogans are. So if you have one good three-word slogan, then 6 must be better. And Poilievre did well, did well. But he didn't win. So this is a comparison of 2021 to 2025. And so, yeah, the Liberals went up 10 seats, okay? But the Conservatives went up 24 seats, okay? Look at the popular vote. 41.3% for the Conservatives is higher than what Stephen Harper got in 2011. When he formed a majority government. It's the highest any Conservative has gotten since 1988 and Brian Mulroney's majority. But the Liberals did even better, okay? And if you look at that combined total, which is 85%, the last time the Liberals and the Conservatives combined had over 80% of the vote was 1930. The reason the Liberals, and that predates the Bloc and predates the NDP. We had the Progressives and some other minor parties. But it really shows that the reason the Liberals won is the collapse of the other parties. So look at the Bloc Québécois. They dropped 10 seats. Now, 1% doesn't sound like a lot, but when you only run candidates in one province, it's actually a 10-point drop. And that is because, believe it or not, Donald Trump is a unifier. He was able to convince Quebec separatists that the best place to defend the French language, culture, tradition, and history were the Federalists of Canada. And they all voted Liberal, okay? So put this in context with our talk today about Alberta separatism rising, Quebec separatism dropping as a result of Trump. The other is the collapse of the NDP. This is their worst election performance. But in 1993, they also lost party status, and then they rebuilt after. The difference with the Bloc and the NDP is all of those seats that the Bloc lost went to the Liberals. The seats that the NDP lost split, because the NDP is essentially two parties. It's a worker party, steel workers, auto workers, miners. Those candidates in Ontario, they didn't win a single seat in Ontario. They lost seats in Windsor and in Hamilton and in Northern Ontario. Those seats went Conservative. Pierre Poilievre did a very good job of recruiting workers into his party, union workers. But the second element of the NDP were the progressive wing, the urban elite wing, that is concentrated in Greater Vancouver and Vancouver Island. There, where they lost seats, was to the Liberals. So the Bloc vote all went Liberal, but the NDP vote split in two directions because the NDP has become two parties warring in the bosom of one. But putting it as a map helps to explain things. So you can, the top part of the map of Canada is a bit deceptive because it looks like, the Conservatives just dominated everywhere because geography doesn't vote. So I'll just point out Saskatchewan. That looks like the Liberals won half of Saskatchewan. That's one riding. The Manitoba one at the top, that's one riding. What is more interesting are the cities, and not every city. So, Montreal, you see an awful lot of red there. Toronto, an awful lot of red there, okay? Vancouver and Victoria. The cities that the Conservatives still did well in were Edmonton, Calgary, Saskatoon, Regina, even Winnipeg, they did not do. The Liberals still did well. Okay, so that is a bit deceptive. Okay, but it tells the story that this country is regionally divided. It's regionally divided. Okay. Okay. What about Alberta? Well, from a seat perspective, not much difference from 2021. And bear in mind, we gained 3 seats compared to 2021. Where the difference is in the vote total. So the Conservative vote total actually went up 9 points, but the Liberals went up 13 points, the largest Liberal vote in the province of Alberta since 1968. Why did the Liberal vote go up? Look at the collapse of the NDP. Okay, it replicates what we saw nationwide. So we have a very interesting phenomenon in Alberta, where progressive voters vote NDP provincially and Liberals federally, with the exception of Edmonton Strathcona, which has now become the strongest NDP seat in the entire country, is in Alberta. Heather McPherson won, Linda Duncan won that previously. It's also the home riding of Rachel Notley. It's currently absent because we haven't called a by-election in there yet. Okay. So what are the consequences of this? Well, I had said during the campaign that if the Liberals won 4 or 5 seats, as I thought that they could, it wouldn't change the balance of power very much, but it would be a brake on potential national unity issues. But with only 2, it doesn't. Now, I was slightly wrong on that because the Liberals have 170 seats. You add an extra 3 seats to them, they're at 173, which puts them in majority territory. But really, the challenge that the Liberals have is while their vote total went up dramatically, not their seat total, meaning there's not many Liberal MPs to speak for Canada. Okay. Here is a sense of the popular vote. So, if you look at the top, the blue and the slight green in the middle, and then blue again, what we see is the Conservatives have dominated in this province since the late 1950s. But there have been times when the Conservatives did better than what they did in this past election. But look at the Liberals. This is by far their highest vote total compared to what we saw in 2019. The NDP dropped, the Greens dropped. Okay, so I already pre-set this up where Danielle Smith, the day after the election, tabled legislation to make it easier for a referendum. Okay. Then she gave a TV address, and much of what I'm going to talk about relates to that. Well, I guess it was a video address that she put out about 2 weeks ago. Okay, so this is the threshold. Okay, so 600,000 signatures to 200,000 signatures. Actually, it's about 177. Okay, 3 months, now you have 4 months, and there's no distribution requirement. It used to have roughly equal distribution between Calgary, Edmonton, and the rest of the province. Now you don't need that. So as a consequence of this, and it passed last Thursday, it hasn't been given royal assent yet, but it will. And I expect that we will be having in 2026 a referendum on separation in this province. I have absolutely no doubt about that. Do I think that you could get 200,000 signatures on to separate? Absolutely. And groups are already mobilizing online before they've even gathered the physical signatures. Right? Now, this is important because it allows, oops, I'm going the wrong way. It allows Smith to say the government is not holding a referendum. And then she also says, but I'm making it really, really easy for those that do. Okay? René Lévesque campaigned on separation, had a referendum. His party was unified. He didn't leave it to outside actors. Jacques Parizeau did the same thing. He didn't leave it to outside actors. And so as a result, Smith is saying, I'm not a separatist. I'm just making it easier for separatists, meaning she has alienated the separatists who want her to go full-scale Lévesque, and she's alienated federalists who believe that making this easy is irresponsible. Okay. Then the May 5th address. Much of that address, and it was 20 minutes long, was about the familiar and in many cases legitimate grievances Alberta has towards the federal government. These are things that Smith has said, that Kenney has said, and for that matter, Rachel Notley has said, and Naheed Nenshi has said. And Smith amplified these during the federal election, not just in Canada, but in the United States as well. And I mentioned the list of 9 demands. Then she goes, she wanted bilateral negotiations between Ottawa and Alberta with 4 demands. Okay, 1, unfettered access to tidewater, repealing all of those legislation, so tanker ban off the northwest coast of BC, the Impact Assessment Act, which Kenny nicknamed the No More Pipelines bill, which has remained in prominence even though it deals with a lot of other things besides pipelines, the emissions cap, EV regulations, clean fuel regulations, a whole litany of these. Then no export taxes without Alberta's permission. That's all related to the trade war we're having with the United States. And then she uses coded language, and she goes, per capita transfer payments should be in line with the 4 largest provinces. What this is all about is equalization payments to Quebec. Okay. The whole debate about equalization, we actually had a referendum on equalization in 2021. We did nothing with it, but we had a referendum on equalization. It's not about Nova Scotia. It's not about Manitoba. It's all about Quebec. And she doesn't use the word equalization, but it's coded language. Okay, well, each of these demands we could spend, a long time on. The key is she wants not Alberta and the other provinces, but she wants a set of one-on-one negotiations, her and Carney, on like a nation-to-nation level. Why that is important is the other provinces aren't there. Okay? So we've always had negotiations between the federal government and the provincial government, but not on things that affected the rest of the country. This is different. So unfettered access to tidewater, Ottawa, Alberta will decide that. BC, I'm sorry, you don't have a say, because BC's sovereignty is trumped by Alberta's sovereignty. Getting Quebec out of equalization, which would require a constitutional amendment, sorry, the rest of you don't have a say either. She is currently in Yellowknife at the Western Premiers and Northern Territorial Premiers meetings, where she is trying to drum up support to deal with the federal government, while 2 weeks earlier had said, we don't care about the rest of you people. This could be a problem in one-on-one talks. Okay. Now we have the Alberta Next panel. Some of you are young enough to remember 2019, the last time there was a major spike in separatism. Jason Kenney pulled out the Fair Deal panel. And he appointed Preston Manning to go around the province to find out about Fair Deal. In this case, Smith has looked around the province and said, who can I appoint to chair this? Well, Manning, he's chaired too many panels, so it can't be him. I will do it myself, because I guess the premier of the province doesn't have much to do. And she is going to go around. This really looks like Fair Deal Panel 2.0. She promised any recommendations coming out of that we'll also have a referendum on. But we had a referendum on equalization. It passed, and we did nothing with it. She has promised a referendum on the pulling out of the Canadian pension plan, but then kind of acknowledged earlier this month that there's no appetite in Alberta to pull out of the Canadian pension plan, but there is an appetite to pull out of Canada. Okay. As I said, we will have a citizens-initiated referendum. Thomas Lukazik, who is a bit of a mischief maker as well as a former cabinet minister, has no love for Danielle Smith, is also organizing a referendum to stay in Canada. So imagine we have 2 referendum questions. One, do you want to leave Canada? The other, do you want to stay in Canada? What happens if they say yes to both? I don't know what happens. Okay. Now, at the very end of her talk, Smith, looks in the camera and says, this should not be divisive. That we need to treat people who want to leave the country with respect. We need those that never want to leave the country with respect. And all of those in the middle, we need to treat with respect. This is not a debate about a tax rate or a policy decision. This is about breaking up your country. So imagine being with a spouse that you've been married to for 157 years, that you don't have 1 or 2 children, you have 40 million children, and saying, I want to leave and I want to split up, But let's not make this hard. Let's not make this divisive. Ask the people in Quebec. This split up friendships, this split up family members, and unlike some of the voters in Quebec, we've got family members and friendships across the country. There's a lot of Francophone Quebecers who really don't have that many ties outside of Quebec. Albertans do. And now you're going to say, but it shouldn't be divisive, okay? It will be, even having this question, no matter what the result is. Okay, so Angus Reid has been polling on this, and it's consistent with other people's polling, like Janet Brown's, et cetera. So would you vote for a province to leave Canada or stay? And what is noticeable about this is, and I'm only going to focus on Alberta, sorry, Knut, nothing on Saskatchewan, but we could ask questions about Saskatchewan, is 19% hardcore separatists, 52% hardcore federalists. That's a pretty big gap. What they're focused on is the group in the middle that are leaning towards voting to leave, depending on what the issue is. Geez, if we only got rid of the emissions cap, then I would stay. If we only got rid of the pipeline ban, then we would stay. If we only got rid, or we could have plastic straws, I would stay. That's one of her 9 demands, by the way, is plastic straws, okay? Now, so do I think that the vote will be in favor of leaving? No, I don't. We have never seen numbers. The hardcore is in the high teens. The hardcore and the leaning combined is in the 30s. But what happens if you have a debate, referendum, and 30 to 35% of the population want to leave? Like, that's pretty serious, right? That is serious. And what do we do with that? Okay, so that it will be a challenge. Okay, here are some of the things. Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting. And Danielle Smith has admitted that this is about keeping her party together and not creating a separatist party. Well, there's already separatist parties. They call themselves the Republican Party of Alberta. Take that for what you want. But if you look at the UCP, 65% are either definitely wanting to separate or leaning towards separation. The NDP, very different. So within the UCP caucus voting base, there is a third that want to leave no matter what, a third that want to leave depending on what concessions Ottawa could offer, and a third that think this is the stupidest idea they've ever heard, that what they want is to keep the NDP out of power and have low taxes, not break up the country. How do you reconcile those? Ask Jason Kenney how well he was able to keep the UCP together over vaccines. And as bad as vaccine divisions were, breaking up the country will be worse. This is about partisanship. Had Pierre Poilievre become prime minister, the vote would have gone completely different. We wouldn't be having this discussion. And you could say, well, look at everything that Carney has done since. Well, what has he done? He's promised to build pipelines. He got rid of Stephen Guilbeault as environment minister. He's had productive conversations with Danielle Smith. Really, this is about the legacy of Justin Trudeau. Because if Poilievre was prime minister, what would he have? Oh, and he also got rid of the consumer-based carbon tax. So this is partisanship, which is why you never heard about separatism between 2006 and 2015. Okay? Asking people, forget about how you would vote, how do you think Albertans would vote? And they also believe, overwhelmingly, that Albertans will vote to stay. Right? What does Smith want? Does she want to separate? Does she want leverage? So this is all about leverage. The problem is, this was also seen as an argument the Quebecers made, what they called the knife at the throat strategy. But knife at the throat only works if you have a knife, right? Quebec separatism was real, and it wasn't transactional. It goes back hundreds of years. 1995, if 40,000 people had voted the other way, who knows where we would be right now. But look at the polls that we have seen. At one point in Quebec in the early 90s, separatism was over 60%, right? So that was a credible threat, okay? If you're walking in saying, we will leave, and polls show only 30% believe you, that's not much of a knife, okay? So I will stop it there. I've probably given lots to chew on. There were things I didn't talk about because we wanted an opportunity for you to talk. So come up to the mic and ask your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for breaking that down as easily as you could within that time frame allotted. I would like to note that sessions are recorded and will be made available both on SACPA's website, YouTube channel, and shown on Rogers TV community channel if you need to go back and re-listen to that a little bit. I do also just want to do a quick mention before we get further in here that, again, if you have any questions, please funnel them to the front here, or if you would like to ask them in person, please come and line up to the wall. We do ask that you keep your introductions short, just in the spirit of time and conversation, but I will now open up the floor.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm Maria Fitzpatrick, and I am Canadian, and I plan on staying a Canadian. Now, actually, I have two questions to you. The first one is, how do we get a provincial government that actually works for our province? And the second question is, she's still going to go after CPP because there's been a petition that's already sent out. Yep. So I want to stop that too, because every one of us who has worked is affected by CPP, and if she takes Alberta out, we'll all be affected by it.
Okay. So how do you get the government that you want? It's simply voting an organization. The 2023 election was the closest that we have seen in this province, and what we saw was a massive rural-urban split. So within the province, within Calgary and Edmonton proper, there are 46 seats. And the NDP won every seat in Edmonton and a majority of the seats in Calgary for the first time. But in the rest of the province, including Lethbridge, there are 41 seats, and the UCP won 37 of those. And so there's a handful of ridings. One of them is in Lethbridge. The others that were in Northeast Calgary, suburban Edmonton, Red Deer, those are going to make and break an election. As far as pulling out of the CPP, so the government of Alberta commissioned Janet Brown to do a poll on that, and they gave that poll result to Rick Bell, and he torqued it up by saying a majority of Albertans now want to leave the Canadian Pension Plan. But when you look at the tables, the tables were very different because there was a category that said, I need more information. And what Bell did is he pulled that out and ignored it and went with the separate. The other is that the question said, would you agree to move out of the Canadian Pension Plan if you received the same benefits or better than what you do now? Okay, that's not a fair question. That's and it's like the surveys that Jim Dinning put out, where he said, when we establish, not if, but when we establish an Alberta pension plan, which would you like? Lower contributions, more benefits, or a lower retirement age, okay? So it would be like saying, do you want cake or do you want ice cream? Right? We'll have to see if there will be a referendum question on pensions, because I think that's going to be part of the Alberta Next panel. And Smith has promised a referendum on that. We will see how that goes. But outside of Brown's poll, which, as I said, was slightly torqued, or a lot torqued, depending on your viewpoint, we have never seen majority support to pull out the Canadian Pension Plan, because there are very serious questions about how much money Alberta would get, What would that investment look like? And what about mobility? And anyone who says, well, Quebec has their own plan, they were created simultaneously, and they're interlinked. Pulling out after 60 years is incredibly complex, just like pulling out of Canada would be incredibly complex. So hopefully I addressed those two questions. Next, sir.
Hi, Dwayne. Henning Mundel is my name. Yep. And mine is sort of two questions, but really one. You mentioned the Alberta Republicans, but so I want to put it in the context. Do you think in the chance of getting rid of this USP government, that will help, that in other words an NDP government is more likely because of the Alberta Republicans and maybe other rogue players on the right?
It depends on how big the party becomes. So as I said, we've always had separatist parties, but we are going to have a federal by-election in Battle River Crowfoot. They've announced that they will run a separatist candidate in there. We will have, when Premier Smith finally calls them, at least 3 by-elections. What would that look like? Already Cam Davies, the leader of the Alberta Republicans, is going to run in Old Stidsbury. And let's see what their results were. Because when I mentioned that one separatist who's been elected in 40 years, it was in Old Stidsbury. And in by-elections, you have a lot more freedom. So could this hurt the UCP by splitting the party? I think the indications will become what those by-elections look like.
Ron Solinsky. I wonder if you could comment just briefly on the legality of separation. Provinces east of Manitoba were pre-existent to the formation of Canada. Canada was pre-existent to Alberta, and as I understand it, granted Alberta the right to become a province. So can we in fact even legally separate?
So I'll raise it in 2 ways. One is the reference case that the Supreme Court dealt with in the late 1990s in the aftermath of the Quebec referendum and the forthcoming Clarity Act. The Clarity Act said that if a province had a clear question and a clear majority. Now, they don't define what a clear majority is, but I had Stéphane Dion speak to my class, and he was asked what a clear majority was, and he siphoned off Slovenia's referendum and Croatia's referendum and Slovakia's referendum. Those were all in the 90s. Is 50% plus 1 a clear majority? I don't think so. We couldn't change our electoral system with 50% plus 1. I don't know how we would split up the country. But had there been a clear question and a clear majority, then there is an obligation on the rest of Canada to negotiate that. Those would not be easy negotiations. What do we do about federal buildings? What do we do about taxes? What do we do about debt? How do you split up the assets? So think about how difficult a divorce is with, let's say, $1 million worth of assets. Now you try doing that with multiple trillions of dollars. Or look at how many years it took the United Kingdom to pull out of the European Union. That involved multiple prime ministers and multiple governments, and they weren't even the same country. So yes, I think legally they can under the Clarity Act, but there would be negotiations around that. And there's already a lot of misinformation about what independence would mean. That somehow it would mean you get to have your borders, you wouldn't send taxes, you wouldn't have to worry about federal laws, but you would keep your passport and you would keep your citizenship and you keep your pension and all of that. The second legal one, and this is more complicated, is around Indigenous rights. So Indigenous chiefs are livid about this. And they point out correctly that they signed a treaty not with the government of Alberta, not even with the government of Canada, but with the Crown. And it predates Alberta by decades. Now, Smith amended her legislation and said any separation would recognize and fulfill treaty rights. I don't know how you square those, and no one else does either. But you talk to hardcore separatists and you ask them this question, and they basically don't care. So Keith Wilson, who's one of the lawyers, he was also a lawyer involved with the Wild Rose Party, said, look, Indigenous people, you get one vote just like anyone else. You're not special. That's assimilation. And so the question is, are other Albertans concerned about the impact on treaty rights? So the Clarity Act, as complex a process as that would be, is minor compared to the issue of treaty rights.
Thank you, Ken Sears. I've actually got two not really related questions. The first one has to do with Danielle Smith's dependence upon the continued support for the old Western Canada Concept Gang.
Yeah.
You know, they've had about a dozen names. I call them the Rexit Gang.
Yep.
But she needs them in order to even maintain the leadership of the party.
Yeah.
So what sort of impact is that going to have? The second thing is, as of this Saturday, the Electoral Redistribution Commission is starting a tour of the province.
Yeah.
They're meeting in Pincher Creek next Saturday morning. They're meeting here Saturday evening.
Yeah.
It's already been announced, 2 more seats, that's it.
Yeah.
That's the maximum number of seats they're going to increase the number by for the legislature. Logically, given the numbers, those should go to Calgary and Edmonton.
Yeah.
What do you see happening there? Because I think there's going to be, there's a temptation for the UCP to try and really manipulate that process.
Okay. So the first question is, what could be the I agree, the UCP needs the separatist vote, right? So even if you say that the hardcore separatists are 15% of the population, okay, those 15%, probably 12 to 13% of 12 to 13 out of the 15 voted UCP in the last election. The others voted for the Freedom Party and the Maverick Party and whatever the name of the party is today. Had they received 15% of the vote, we'd be talking about Premier Notley right now. So this is a major concern that Danielle Smith has. Now, she justified, for example, her floor crossing in 2014 by saying, you know, if she hadn't crossed the floor and hadn't unified the parties, that the NDP would govern. Even though at the time that she did it, the NDP had, you know, 4 seats. So I think it was a post facto explanation. But she has said repeatedly that her goal is to keep the UCP united, even if it means breaking up the country or threatening to break up the country. Okay. As far as the electoral boundaries are concerned, I have a lot of faith in our boundaries commissions. People don't, I do. And it's not just about the 2 additional seats. It's once you add seats, you're changing boundaries. And of all other seats, and that's where things get complicated. So I have faith in the Boundaries Commission, but we do know that the UCP, since Smith, much more differently than Klein or Kenney, has been getting rid of arm's length agencies, whether that's Alberta Health Services, whether that's municipalities, whether that's policing, whether that's post-secondary, whether that's the Elections Alberta. Most recently, it involved some other groups as well. That is a concern if the report comes out and they just said, well, we're going to get rid of that group, and we're going to appoint different people to get us a better answer. So at the moment, I have faith in the Boundaries Commission, as I have consistently.
I'm going to try and rotate through a little bit just so we get to everybody. So I've received a couple questions from the audience, and the first one is, my question is regarding what, in your opinion, led to the loss of Pierre Poilievre's seat in Parliament when the Conservatives gained a proportion of the vote in Ontario? This is asked in particular in regards to the upcoming by-election in East Central Alberta. And does the party come before the constituents?
So how did Poilievre lose? How did he lose a seat that he had held for 20 years, even though the Conservative vote went up? And how did he lose so badly? He lost by almost 4,000 votes. On the one hand, you could say, well, he went up against a strong local candidate who spent 2 years knocking on doors. Poilievre, because he was leader of the opposition, could not spend a whole lot of time campaigning. But I think it fundamentally came down to one thing, and that was Poilievre's support of the Ottawa convoy. That may have played very well in parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan. It did not play well in the city of Ottawa. And even though this is what we call a rural-urban riding, where parts of the riding are in Ottawa and parts of the riding are in the countryside, even those in the countryside would have had to go into the city. That was incredibly disruptive for 6 weeks. So I believe he lost the election by bringing coffee and donuts to the convoyers.
Hello, I am Katie Aurora, and I'd actually just like to offer maybe a little bit of extra context because I actually used to live in Ottawa, bordering Poilievre's riding. He actually came door knocking to my house one time, and I got the very cool opportunity to tell him right to his face. So it was a little bit of a highlight for me, but yeah, the convoy really, truly was not well received in Ottawa. It negatively affected me, my friends. I had friends who lived near the downtown area who were unable to take their daughter safely to medical appointments because of what the convoy were doing. So that anger in Ottawa is real, and good for the people for rejecting Poilievre and that kind of behavior. So anyways, a little bit off topic, but I do have a question regarding the separatists and what exactly...
That's the National Capital Region. That's Ottawa and Gatineau. That is all red, all red. Okay? So, highlights what you just said.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, about the separatists, I'm really curious how you would say that they imagine, if they get their way and they get a successful vote, how do they imagine they're actually going to get what they want? Like, for example, pipelines to Tidewater. Like, if Alberta basically turns into a landlocked country, like, how does that work for us? How do we get oil through BC when it's not only a separate province, but a separate country? Or if you want to talk about some of the pipelines to the east, if we want to go through Saskatchewan and Manitoba, like, how does this actually work?
Okay. So bear in mind that the debate about separatism is less about facts and logic, more about emotion. And that exists in all referendums. And so if you look at Brexit, for example, Nigel Farage said every dollar that we send to the European Union, we would get back and we would pump it into the National Health Services. 2 days after the referendum, Farage was on BBC and said, no, I never said that. We can't make that promise. And then they showed the ads on the buses making that exact promise. There were Quebecers who voted yes in favor of the referendum because they believed that they would still, even though they were an independent country, send MPs to Ottawa and receive equalization funds and still use the Canadian dollar. So you ask them about being a landlocked province, they will talk about the United Nations law of the sea will give us access. That somehow being an independent country would give us greater access to Tidewater than being a province. That is ridiculous. Look at Bolivia, for example. But the other is, well, that's okay. We're just joining the United States anyway, okay? So, okay, let's even assume automatic citizenship. Let's assume they have Senate seats. Let's assume they have House seats. Let's assume they vote in the presidential. Even assume we get dollar for dollar recognition of the Canadian dollar and the US dollar. Okay? And all of those are very iffy assumptions, but let's say that all happens. Would Alberta carry greater weight in the United States than it does in Canada? We would be, instead of the fourth largest province and the economic driver, we would be much lower on the list. We would be Wisconsin. Not to disparage Wisconsin. If you say, well, Alberta's the Texas of Canada, great, Texas carries a lot of weight. We would be a fifth of the size of Texas. or a sixth of the size of Texas. So Texas would carry that weight, Alberta would not. So this is about emotion, or this is about leverage. This is not about facts. But here's the challenge. If you vote to stay, you can always have another referendum. If at first you don't succeed, try and try again. But if you vote to leave, there is no falling back, and then it's over. And so these are some of the questions that you need to ask the Alberta Republican Party, and the UCP MLAs who have been pretty silent on this, and especially Conservative MPs, and there's a lot of those. Pierre Poilievre should be asked on this every day he's campaigning. What is your position on Alberta separatism? He was asked once, and he gave a 10-minute answer. The first 20 seconds was, I support Canadian unity. The other 9.5 was about how bad Mark Carney was. That's not a full-throated endorsement of Canadian unity. So I hope he gets asked that on the doorstep over and over and over again, as well as the other 33 MPs. What do they represent? Do they represent a Bloc Alberta-wa, or do they represent the Conservative Party of Canada?
So we have another question from the audience. Assuming that a referendum does not result in succession, can the notwithstanding clause be used by Alberta influentials?
No. You hear a lot of mythology around the notwithstanding clause, that it applies to everything. It applies to certain aspects of charter rights. It does not apply to the division of powers between federal and provinces. So what could happen is the government of Alberta could say, yeah, we had a referendum and 65% of Albertans said no, but 35% said yes, so we're going to declare Universal Declaration of Independence. Okay? I can't imagine that occurring, but if it did, then we're going down a path that we really don't want to go down. And that would be very dangerous, because it would not just be a snub on public opinion and the rule of law, right? So I hope we never get to that case. Where it gets more murky is if we have a murky referendum question, which is, would you want sovereignty association with the rest of Canada? And that goes 52%, and then they go, well, sovereignty association actually means independence. That can also be complex. That's why a clear majority and a clear question are so critical to the Clarity Act. And I will say the Quebec referendums of 1980 and 1995, they were obstinate. They did not ask very clear questions at all. But the referendum that the Republican Party of Alberta has put forward, that's at least a clear question. Do you want to become a sovereign country independent of the rest of Canada? That's a pretty clear question. Then the question would be what the vote is.
Gail Stephenson. I think that Alberta has been very successful being a protest province. And some of the protests I've been watching and reading a lot of history is a myth. And I'm curious to know exactly how Alberta has been treated so badly for so long by so many people in Canada. And when will journalists start talking about this? Because I think the myth is a real problem and fuels separation. I listened 2 weeks ago on Power and Politics, a high-profile person from Alberta claiming that Alberta is the economic engine of Canada. That's based on oil and gas, which is 5% of Canada's GDP. Now that's a pretty damn sputtery engine, if it's 5%. And David Cochrane said something to the effect that, in response to that, saying, well, try to tell that to the rest of Canada. We're in a situation, I'm old enough to remember from another province, I didn't live here then, almost daily meltdowns by Peter Lougheed fighting Senior Trudeau over the National Energy Program. And when Mulroney became the Prime Minister, he ended the program and sold Petrocan. It seems to me now that what Alberta wants is what Pierre Elliott Trudeau's vision was then. It was a pipeline to the East Coast, refine the oil for export. But here we are. And is part of the rebuttal to separation talking about the myth, which isn't just a myth, it's a lie?
Well, as I said, this is being driven by myths and emotion. So yes, Alberta by far is the richest province in Canada. Even during the economic downturn of 2014 and 2022, we were still the richest province in the country. The argument is we would be wealthier. We'd be so much wealthier. Or what they'll do is they'll compare Alberta's wealth to state wealth in the United States, which is very complicated because it's mixing apples and oranges. But that's the mythology. So when they talk about all of the things that have been designed to keep it in the ground, last year, we had the largest oil production in Alberta's history. The Trudeau government bought a pipeline and built a pipeline, the only pipeline to Tidewater. But that is also ignored. Nobody wants to take credit for TMX. So it is about mythologies. And you can't just diminish mythologies. You need to produce a counter myth. Because these types of votes are often about feelings and emotions than they are about hard facts. It's the difference between your head and your heart. And I think those are some of the challenges at play here.
Leona Jacobs. So this one should be easy for you because it's a technical question. Okay. My question has to do, my curiosity has to do with the role of Elections Alberta and possibly Elections Canada, and the Clarity Act is all mixed up in that, in determining the question. Yeah. And whether this Republican Party question or Lukaszyk's question, because it's in front of Elections Alberta right now. So what role do these organizations play in determining the question?
And that's the problem, because so the Clarity Act only determines whether it's a clear question afterwards. They don't give advanced thumbs up, thumbs down. The second is, this isn't coming from the government of Alberta. This is coming from citizens groups. So under the Citizens Initiative referendum, you produce your own question, which is why Lukaszych is going to say, we're going to run our own question that's the exact opposite of that question. And you could have, under law, the government doesn't get to pick and choose. The government has to put both of those on the ballot, right? And so that's a technical question. As far as Elections Alberta, when I talked about how we've been stripping authority from third parties in this province, Elections Alberta is one of them. This current changes to our election laws greatly diminishes the power of Elections Alberta to investigate things, and it has weakened them. So we don't know where that will stand. But from a technical point of view, you want to put the question on, you decide the question, and if you can get 200,000 or 177,000 votes, then it goes on the ballot. What happens if there's 5 questions, all very similar or different? Fun times.
Thank you. I'm Joe Manuel. I'm with the Lethbridge Herald. I'm also a dual citizen. Been living in Canada since 2010, visiting since 2000. So I can see the best and worst of both worlds. I have, unfortunately, friends on both sides of the issue: hardcore separatists and hardcore unity. Yeah. Whenever I bring in, you brought up some of the 800-pound gorillas in the room already, and I brought all my separatist friends. They just say, it's not illegal, blah, blah, blah. But then when I break out, well, you do know if we separate, you have to come up with your own currency, your own passport, your own defense, And the biggest gorilla of them all, when they say, we'll just join the U.S., and I go, you're not familiar with the U.S. healthcare system or extreme lack thereof, because sadly, in the U.S., it's one of the number one source of personal bankruptcy because unseen. So, why this? I get a lot of echoes on that. So, can you just answer, like, again, with the emotions of? It's like they ignore the fact about that Canada's healthcare system is not perfect, but it sure beats the heck out of anything they have in the U.S. right now.
Right. Okay. So there's a lot there. I'm also a dual citizen. I was born in Ontario, so I have Ontario citizenship and Alberta citizenship. Every country determines citizenship differently. Canada, for example, acknowledges dual citizenship. Other countries, like Iran, do not. So when the Iranians shot down that Ukrainian plane that had a lot of Canadians on it, they don't acknowledge them as Canadians because they were born in Iran, right? So what happens if separation occurs and the government of Canada says, we are stripping you of your Canadian citizenship? They can't say, no, you can't. We've had prime ministers not born in this country. We didn't have a citizenship law until after World War II. So that would be one of those points of negotiations. As part of when they talk about the low tax rates of the U.S. and how much they'd be better off, what they don't include is the additional health insurance that you would then have to pay. But if you ask, we'll figure that out after. Just vote yes, and we'll figure this out later. So those are powerful gorillas that do make it complicated. So Jacques Parizeau said separatism would be a magic wand. It would solve all problems. And Parizeau was the only person who actually had a plan for after the referendum. And it was clear how he was going to do it. And yes, they were going to keep the Canadian dollar. There's nothing stopping the Republic of Alberta from using the Canadian dollar. Ecuador uses, El Salvador uses the American dollar. What it would mean is we would have no control over monetary policy. And so those are all very difficult questions that you really don't want to talk about. You'd rather say it'll solve everything. It would be, look at all the tax revenue that would flow back into Alberta without saying, okay, now you have to build all of those services that the federal government currently does. Well, those are one-time costs. Yes, those would be one-time costs. So there's a lot of complications, and hopefully, because I said we will have a referendum, maybe 5 referendums, that we actually start to hash some of this stuff out. So hopefully I addressed most, if not all, of what you asked.
Hi, good afternoon. Justin Ellis. My question's around the permanency of this particular decision and second sober thought and buyer's remorse. So you've mentioned, well, lots of the questions and lots of the discussions been about facts, and the whole essence of SACPA is that informed citizens are the lifeblood of a free and democratic society. But when you bring that emotion in, I'm wondering if the average citizen will have the information necessary to make an informed decision. And I think of buying a device or a computer. I've got 30 days to return it. If I'm in Ontario, if I buy a car, I can return it within 7 days. If I don't like who I voted for, I've got to wait 4 years, but I can vote that person out. But even now, we're so impatient that we've introduced legislation that allows us to call an election in the middle of an election cycle, or to replace a candidate. So my question to you is, learning from Brexit, and in such an emotional context, would it be fair to have a vote to separate or not to separate, followed by a cooling off period, and then a, are you sure? And then a cooling off period, and then are you really sure? And I'm quite serious about it, because the emotion will get people to vote, but when they realize, oh, we don't get this, or we don't get that, then and you might get more people involved. We have an issue with voter apathy. And then you hear a little bit more, and then it stimulates a conversation, then you get one more chance at it, because you don't get 4 years and then you change your mind. So I know they would have to be legislated, but is that something that you think would be possible to include when making this decision?
In an ideal world, absolutely. But that's not the way the legislation is set up. And so I'll give you an example of Brexit. Boris Johnson won an election on get Brexit done, even though there was a lot of buyer's remorse of what has happened. But the problem is the economy went in a tailspin in Britain, but it was at the same time as COVID. So what was the cause of it? And so they're still in a lot of denial about what happened there. So I go back to the 1995 referendum. Had that vote been slightly different, Jacques Parizeau would have declared independence the next day. Okay, then where do you go? If you have a premier who, here's an example of buyer's remorse. Let's say you don't want to separate, but you wanted to use it as leverage. So you go into the ballot and says, I don't actually want to leave Canada, but I'm going to vote yes because it will give us leverage. If enough people think that way, all of a sudden you get 51% of the vote. Okay, and then where do you go from there? What happens if you had a referendum campaign and you had the premier saying the same thing she's saying now, which is, well, I don't support separatism, but I have all these grievances, that's not a lot of leadership. How would you vote? I can tell you how Jacques Parizeau voted, and he would tell you, or Lucien Bouchard or René Lévesque. That's what makes this so complicated. So yes, there should be a cooling off period. But as I said, if you have a separation referendum and it fails, you can have another one. There's going to be another one in Scotland. Okay? We saw 2 in Quebec. We may see a 3rd in Quebec. But it's not like, if you have a teenager or a late teen who moves out of the house and then they move back in, you don't tell them you left the house at 19, you can't come back. There's often a revolving door. Not when you're talking about a country. And so would I like a cooling down period? Absolutely. Is that going to happen? No. Sorry.
Just a light discussion for this afternoon. From all of the comments that were added, I do want to remind everybody again that these sessions are recorded and are available both on SACPA's website, on YouTube, and shown on Rogers TV community channel. I say this again because I think this is worth revisiting once, twice, maybe 3 times over. I also want to mention that SACPA memberships are encouraged and available at $30 per year, and LSCO memberships are also useful. However, neither are required to attend sessions. A suggestion box is available for audience ideas and comments to improve our sessions, and donations are obviously always much appreciated, and there's jars sitting on the tables if you wish to support us in those ways as well. LSCO has kindly provided this room for free of charge, and if you'd like, and I'm sure you already have, please go and get the second round of goodies from their lunch counter. And I'd also like to take a minute to thank the University of Lethbridge, as well as Rogers TV and Tangle Media for their value support in this as well. Thank you also to the Lethbridge Herald and other media coverage for all of their support in that realm too. I will take a minute to announce next week's topic and speaker because I think that they jive really well together. On May 29th, we'll have Trevor Lewington speaking on finding opportunity in the storm. What are the impacts of tariffs and trades on Southern Alberta? I know we've gone over a little bit, but I do want to leave everybody with a take-home message from yourself, maybe to wrap the day up or to lead into next week's discussion.
Thank you. Does that mean we're done? We're wrapped up. Okay, thank you, everybody.